Welcome everyone, and thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules to dial in to talk with Dave and myself this afternoon. Each year Communicorp runs a Senior Leaders Business Forum, where I guess the intent is to engage senior leaders across industry and discuss emerging topics around workplace mental health. And this year, for obvious reasons, we're doing things a little bit different. And we're conducting this live stream to, I guess, reach out there to those leaders, executives and professionals across industry to talk about workplace mental health and the challenge in the current climate, especially around uncertainty and unpredictability. So Dave, thanks very much for joining me this afternoon.
Great to be here, mate.
Great, and we've got an action-packed afternoon for you. But before we begin, we might move into a bit of an acknowledgement of country. So regardless of where you're viewing us from today, I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this region. Cool. And look, before we get into the content, it is probably worthwhile to introduce ourselves, who we are, where we're coming from, and I guess the lens that we bring to workplace mental health. So I'll start off. My name's Mark. I'm a registered psych with a background in organisational psychology. And people often ask me, what that is, and I like to think about it as looking at organisations, the systems and processes, and how individuals and teams work within those systems and processes. And I guess then looking at how we can protect, prevent, and promote positive mental health within the workplace. I've got a diverse background and career to date, which I feel incredibly privileged to have. I spent nearly a decade in the Australian Army as a psych officer, and managed to, I guess, serve both here in Australia and overseas on operations. And now I'm really fortunate enough to lead a very talented team of psychologists, very much specialising in workplace mental health, and more importantly, I guess, that prevention and early intervention of mental ill health and the promotion of positive mental health. So that's a little bit about me and the lens that I bring to this space, and I'll hand over to Dave, and Dave can introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So good afternoon, everyone. Dave Anthony is my name. I am a managing psychologist with Communicorp. I started my career, much like Mark, in the Army as an Army psychologist, and spent a number of years working around Australia and overseas, supporting our defence personnel doing what they do. Personally and professionally, a really rewarding experience, and one that taught me a lot about the value of workplace mental health, regardless of what our workplace looks like. I jumped out of full-time service 9 years ago now, it seems like yesterday, and went back to do a Master of Sport and Exercise Psychology, and more recently a PhD in Performance Psychology. And one of the things that I love about the experiences that I've had, and one of the things that I love about what we do with Communicorp, is we move towards this sort of early intervention and prevention lens regarding workplace mental health. And for me, that's probably one of the areas where we have a great opportunity to make a difference. I've been fortunate enough to work across high-performing organisations, sports environments, clinical and forensic settings, and the thing that I love most about my job is the opportunity to learn every day from the people that we're working with. And whilst we don't have people in the room with us today, we'll have the panel later on that we can get their insights, but we'd love the opportunity to hear from you out there with your questions a little bit later on, and we'll give you those details in a moment. So who is Communicorp? Probably a pretty important question. For those of you that don't know much about us, we're registered psychologists, and we have a diverse range of skills that Mark identified earlier. We've got our organisational psychs, we've got sort of sports psychs, we've got some clinical psychs on the books, and we've got educational and developmental psychologists on the books as well. And one of the things that allows us to bring is sort of a, if you like, a specialisation across psychology that is diverse and applies to a range of workplaces, and I think that's a really unique strength of what we do. Our focus, I mentioned it earlier, but specifically we want to focus on this notion of creating psychologically safe and healthy workplaces. And for us, whilst we take this systemic approach to that, it's very much focused on this notion of prevention. What are the ways that we can learn and apply various psychological theories that fit within a workplace environment to essentially improve psychological health and safety. So what are we talking about today, Mark?
Well, I guess, Dave, it's a really good question because for us, I think part of that, what you mentioned in there, is very much that learning aspect and learning from each other. And for us, that's the aim of today, is very much to start to promote some thought around psychological health and safety in the workplace. I guess especially in the current climate. There is a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability at the moment, and there are challenging times, and there's a lot of variability across Australia at the moment as well, depending on where that workplace is located. So that's very much the intent behind today, is to start to think around how can we manage workplace mental health from a preventative lens, and I think also a good opportunity to just stop and pause and reflect on what we're doing at the moment. I think a lot of workplaces and organisations have been moving at a million miles an hour since COVID started earlier this year in March, and I think it's a really good opportunity for us just to pause and reflect, think about what are we doing well. Maybe what are some of those areas that we can improve, and potentially, what are some of those areas that we can start to focus on and start to do as well. And that's very much the aim of today's session, is to engage you out there, to I guess take you on that journey to reflect on workplace mental health and what are some of the current challenges in that space.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it's interesting. We think about this notion of hazards, and we're very familiar with the physical hazards, and if nothing else, I think of the range of mediums out there that we constantly get told about the importance of hand hygiene and social distancing, and the other sort of physical controls around this notion of protecting ourselves from COVID. But one of the interesting things for me is the focus when we think about the psychological risk. What are the psychological controls that we can put in place? There's a big focus on the illness aspect of that. When we talk about mental illness and ill health, without sort of thinking about what are the ways that we might be able to sort of better manage or prepare from a preventative or early intervention perspective. And that's one of the things that we try and draw parallels with today. You can see the other points of the agenda there. Of course, what are these hazards from a psychological risk perspective? What are the ways that we might be able to better understand the evidence-based approaches to controlling psychological risks? And of course, what are the ways we can evaluate our control measures? And I guess that's where we'll see the Q&A panel jump in and talk more about their experiences, of which, of course, you'll be one of those panel members, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely, and very much looking forward to it. And I guess the way for you today to communicate with us on the panel, we're excited to have a couple of guests join us after the main body of the presentation, is to email through your questions to info@communicorpgroup.com. So please take the opportunity, grab out a pen and paper now, write down that email address, keep some notes of the questions you would like to ask. Feel free to send through those questions during the presentation, but we will have that designated area or time at the end of the forum to kind of go through those questions. So please take that opportunity to engage with us. We're keen to hear what your thoughts are out there and what challenges you're facing and maybe what some of the questions you might have for the panel. But we'll also put that email address up on the screen again later. But please take the time out to please engage with us at the end of the presentation.
Yeah.
Cool. So I guess the first question, Dave, is how do you think COVID-19 has impacted the lives of our people? and I guess of the Australian population. And for those who are viewing today, I'd be keen for you to start to reflect on and maybe take some notes. How has COVID-19 impacted the employees within your organisation, or maybe even your customers, the people you're engaging with, families, friends, those around us?
Yeah, look, great question, and probably one that we've all thought long and hard about. Well, I don't know, maybe not all of us, but I know it's one of the things that constantly comes up for me. It's this notion that, and we're trying to provide services to organisations, what are the ways that we can take that personal lens to say, well, these are the things that I'm experiencing as I live this. How does that extrapolate out to other people's experiences? And whilst we acknowledge that individual perception is reality, I think overall this notion of uncertainty, what is my workplace of the future going to look like? How am I going to continue to manage the challenges that I sometimes face, or that I currently face, I should say? And what are the ways that we might have to sort of better prepare ourselves for that? And for me, the underlying theme that applies to that uncertainty is also this notion of fear as well. It's this fear of the unknown, and we know our brains like to feel as though they have a sense of control, and when that's taken away, we probably spend a lot more time worrying and ruminating than we should.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really valid point, isn't it, around that fear and how as humans we crave that certainty and predictability, and when we have that certainty and predictability, it creates that sense of safety for us. And when that's threatened, then that can be incredibly challenging for us as individuals to kind of operate and feel safe and thrive in. And I think, it's not only just the uncertainty within the workplace, but also the uncertainty in everything at the moment that is kind of threatening that sense of safety.
Yeah, very much so. And, tell us about these stats.
So look, I think, there is some data to also, I guess, back up, what people are experiencing out there. And it's no surprise that the level of stress since COVID has occurred has increased. People are reporting higher levels of stress now compared to pre-COVID. And I'll make some assumptions or some hypotheses around that. Good scientist approach, and I think it's also a little bit validated by those experiences in terms of engaging with workplaces out there. Yeah. But very much, it is driven by that uncertainty and unpredictability, and also that pretty significant and consistent change that we're going through, and not knowing when the next change is going to occur. It's change in terms of the nature of the work we're doing, the way we're working, and the way that we're interacting with people. And I'd argue that it's not just the increased levels of stress, but it's also the reduction in our ability to engage with our usual coping mechanisms that we might normally engage with. Whether that might be things like going to the gym, socialising with friends, heading out, seeing family members who might be interstate. I think we've had restrictions placed on us that has then kind of challenged our ability to engage in those usual coping strategies. Yeah,
so we've almost got this notion where we've there's a workplace factors, and we'll talk about psychosocial factors later on that are essentially those things that underlie the reports of stress. But when we see this blur between what is our workplace and what is our home life, how do we actually tease out what are work-related psychosocial factors and what are personal life related psychosocial factors?
We could go off on a complete tangent there.
We could, and we probably shouldn't.
Yeah. But I think we're seeing some other data come out, I guess, through the current climate as well around symptoms of distress. And it's, for me, it doesn't sit as a surprise that people are feeling more emotionally exhausted, because I think the current climate is challenging and it is emotionally draining, and that to me doesn't really it does not present as a surprise.
Yeah, very true. And there's a few stats up there that talk about these signs of symptoms of distress. And I guess and when we think about how that moves into this notion of the effects on the workplace. We can look at these stats around, productivity and we talk about sort of the prospect of being more productive, which is an interesting one. You might be surprised by the stats from Qualtrics that are up on the screen there. It's this notion that we've got 25.5% that talks about being more productive, 42 about the same, and 32% being less productive. Now, if I think about that from a performance perspective, that's not necessarily doom and gloom, and it's probably really important to think about, how do we take that information as a means to identify what are the ways that we can learn from this and change the way or the views of how we work best as we move into the future. But we'll talk about that later.
And look, I think it's important to recognise that these stats, whilst very recent, are probably considered a little bit old as well, because they're a couple of months old now, and there has been such consistent change. So I wonder, what would that currently look like? And I'd ask you to reflect on that in terms of your organisations. As we progress through this journey, what changes have you seen in terms of fatigue level and burnout and productivity within your organisations?
Yeah, and I won't claim this as my own quote. I heard it on a podcast that I was listening to, funnily enough. A lot less time I listen to podcasts when we don't travel as much, but I was out having a stroll and listening to a podcast, and there was a senior executive in an organisation said, about his experience working from home was, I don't know whether I'm, working from the home office or sleeping at work, which, we think about the long-term effects of that from a fatigue perspective. That can be, that's something that these stats probably don't take into account.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognise that everyone's having different experiences in Australia at the moment. My own personal circumstances, 6 weeks ago I was in Victoria, and I have since relocated to Queensland. And being in Victoria, those, being in lockdown and stage 4 restrictions and viewing what people were doing in WA or my family was doing in Queensland, and very different work environments and very different social and home environments as well. And I think there's different challenges and different experiences there for both individuals, teams, and organisations.
Yeah, and of course you served your requisite 14-day quarantine in the hotels as well. But it's an interesting sort of consideration, isn't it? When we have national work teams and we have people working in different offices that are located in different cities and states, how do we approach that from a best practice perspective overall?
And that is a really challenging and complex question. So why don't we start to look at how do we approach that from a best practice and systematic approach? And I think this probably comes to no surprise to those dialing in today. This model from Safe Work Australia around risk management, and I guess let's start looking at it from a physical risk lens, and then maybe we can move into a bit of the psychological risk lens, and how do we start to approach that and take that evidence-based best practice approach to managing risk.
Yeah, and it's I'll leave that because we'll come back to it. I think there's a lot we can learn from this, and we sometimes miss the opportunity to make the comparison or draw those parallels between, this model is really familiar to us from a physical safety or physical risk perspective.
Absolutely.
How do we draw on those experiences as means to better inform our psychological risk profiles or controls?
Yeah, and I think it's a model from a physical risk perspective that everyone can relate to. A hazard being something that has the potential to harm a person. And we're currently doing this live stream. It's a fantastic setup. You can't see behind the scenes, but there's wires and cords everywhere. And definitely some potential hazards there in terms of trip hazards and the like. And so, I think it's kind of ingrained into us from that safety perspective of how do we start to control for those hazards. And if we start to look forward or look at the current climate, I think there's been a lot of emphasis absolutely around the physical hazards associated with COVID-19. And that, absolutely there's significant harm there, and there's no debate around that in terms of the virus and the damage that it can do.
Yeah, and we're learning more about it as we go on. We have this understanding about what are those hazards, the physical hazards that we need to be mindful of.
Yep, absolutely. But I guess something that maybe we don't understand as well is what are some of the psychological hazards associated with the current pandemic and the climate that we're operating in. And I'd be keen, and I think that's going to be, that's dependent on a multitude of different levels. I think there's societal levels that we can look at in terms of what those hazards might be, but also organisational, and even potentially teams within the organisations who are maybe focused on different job roles or tasks and different demands of those roles, and then also at the individual level, depending on what's going on around us.
Yeah. Are we customer facing? Do we deal with members of the public? How does that differ if that used to be a core part of my role in Melbourne? How does that translate or compare to experiences of one of my peers or colleagues in Brisbane? And interestingly enough, we talked about stress and we talked about those signs of distress, but whilst we understand some of those physical causes or the physical hazards associated with COVID, we're drilling into outside of this stress and concerns about mental illness and ill health. What are the ways that we better understand the hazards?
Absolutely. And I think there's a few hazards that have absolutely been identified through some recent research, but also through our engagement across industry. And I thought it'd be really worthwhile to kind of start to share what we're observing from our engagement in terms of what some of those psychological hazards are. And I think what we're seeing is organisational change, and that's no surprise that org change is typically considered a psychosocial hazard because it can impact people in many different ways. But I think that the nature of change at the moment is probably the challenge. I'd argue that's almost been exacerbated, and that we're seeing change occur so much quicker than it has been done in the past, and maybe not as much time to prepare or communicate or to put in place some of those usual hazards. And depending on the impact of that change, it's also about the external environment that change is happening in. And we're seeing higher unemployment rates and the like, and maybe if people are change impacted, it may be less likely or having difficulty finding work elsewhere. They might have partners at home who have lost jobs, or there are many different kind of external factors that may impact on that change. And I guess that's the severe end of that change, but I think it's also about even just the nature of change, the way we work, and how we're working as well. That can impact people, and that balance between something like working from home and homeschooling and how we might achieve that.
Yeah, it's an interesting consideration. In one of the conversations that we're having yesterday, talking about some of those other challenges or stressors or whatever you might want to call them outside of the specific work role in the home environment. It may be outside of the workplace, but what does the workplace look like? And we're joking about the amount of gardening that seems to be going on around my neighbourhood, and the amount of people using leaf blowers and whippersnippers and mowers seems to have gone up tenfold. But is that something more related to the fatigue associated with the blurring of work-life boundaries? It's a really interesting sort of question to ask. But when we think about what are those things that relate to or hazards that are more outside of the workplace, to me it gets really difficult to sort of tease those out. You can see there on the slide we talk about and Mark mentioned, talking about the parental and caring responsibilities, the financial stress. We talk about sort of the physical or mental health conditions and how they may start to present. And whether isolation might be good for some people and not as good for others, that's always an individual experience. And that last point there that you touched on earlier, this notion of how do we need to adjust or relearn our coping strategies as a means to identify or best manage the emotional response that comes with our changing environment or a lack of clarity regarding the future.
Absolutely. And I think we've purposely titled this, the presentation today around uncertainty and unpredictability.
Yeah.
And I think, it's a really good opportunity to pause and reflect on in terms of how we're viewing those hazards. The COVID circles of control here, and the assessment is that pre-COVID we had potentially a greater perception of things that we can influence. I guess during COVID, what we're seeing is maybe that perception of what we can influence has decreased significantly. And we're spending a lot more time in that circle of things that are outside of my control. And if we come back to that earlier point around, craving certainty and predictability, which creates us safety, if we're sitting in the circle of things being outside of our control, well, that's really going to drive for us that sense of not feeling safe and not knowing what's going on, and that can be really, really challenging.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot going on, and a lot of questions that individuals are asking themselves around that uncertainty and unpredictability. And I'd be keen for you viewing to reflect on what does that look like within your organisations. What are some of those unique challenges that you're facing at the moment? And what are the questions that your employees or your staff or your colleagues might be asking themselves on a pretty regular basis?
Yeah, and we come back to this notion of fear and uncertainty sort of driving that. So what is the future?
Well, I don't have my crystal ball, unfortunately, and I guess that's another part of that fear and uncertainty, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've specifically kind of moved the circles around there because we don't really know what shape, size, or sphere they're going to look like, because that is that pretty consistent change at the moment, and weekly announcements, for example, down in Victoria. Even if you're in Queensland, challenges around border restrictions and what that means for the economy. So that there is a lot of unknowns out there, and so what that looks like in the future, when, how, what does the future of work look like? We talk about the new normal, but there's no idea what that new normal is really going to be.
Yeah. So we've probably talked about this a little bit. Like in terms of assessing our risks, we've got to a place where, or what we've spoken about already this afternoon, is this notion that there is a risk of harm here, especially from that unknown, and what is the psychological risk? We're exposed to the hazards. So when we start to look at how we better assess this, what are the ways that we might be able to do that? It talks there about the likelihood, the severity, and this is still based on our Safe Work Australia model.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, from a psychological perspective, did you want to talk about these risk factors? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, when we talk about these risk factors, there's things that may exacerbate the risk, or there might be some predisposing factors there. When we're considering, if we've identified the hazard, we're now looking at the risks. How do we actually start to understand this in the current climate? And I guess, there might be things around people may have some predisposing mental ill health concerns. And those mental ill health concerns may be exacerbated by the current hazards or the current climate. I think those, we see risk with those who might be required to quarantine for extended periods of time. And just drawing on personal experience there, it is a challenging situation. And absolutely, there's a lot of supports on offer. But it is a challenge, and we're seeing those. I guess that one of those other risk factors around those who are socially vulnerable, that feeling of loneliness and being isolated, or potentially in unhealthy relationships and the like. And I think those who are also in locations containing a high concentration of COVID-19 cases, and that comes to no surprise, because with it comes a lot of health anxiety and challenges, tighter restrictions, lack of movement, and inability to engage in those normal coping mechanisms.
Yeah, loss of control, right?
Absolutely. Yep. And so when we look at it, I guess if we have, from an individual level, if we're looking at this kind of intolerance of uncertainty, and how does that then lead to rumination and spending more time in that circle of being outside of our control and thinking about things over and over and over, that can be really unhealthy for someone, and can actually start to lead to poor psychological well-being or compromised mental health.
Yeah, and that's not to say that it's something that will result in a diagnosis, but when we start to think about how this transitions into the workplace or how this affects the workplace, whatever that workplace may look like, we can see, sure, we're moving from an individual into a team or a workplace focus, but there's a higher risk of absenteeism, which again sort of takes on its own sort of definition in the current environment. We talk about conflict and psych injury and incivility, and again when we think about some of the challenges that relate to working from home or working in different locations, some of these things are a lot harder to address than they used to be. So there's a higher level of risk there. If I've just had an abrupt email from one of my colleagues, not that I get those, but what are the ways that I can sort of address those? Whereas if it was a conversation in the workplace, it's a much easier process to get up and for want of a better word, talk through the situation to gain a better understanding.
Yeah. And I think, you mentioned in there the absenteeism and what does that look like in the current environment, and I would argue that presenteeism should be there as well. So I might be physically rocking up to my work from home station every day, but not necessarily being engaged with my work and being productive. And I think that's not necessarily just for those who are working from home. I think it's those who are still maintaining job roles out in location and in office spaces or in depots or wherever that might be.
Yeah, very true, very true. So, what are the ways that we start to shift the needle, if you like, if we start to sort of look at this psychologically safe and healthy workplaces continuum? What are the ways that we can start to, not remove these risks? Because the reality is we can't a lot of the time, much like some of those physical risks that we have to look at. What are the ways that we might be able to mitigate or lessen the effect of these risks? And for us, when we talk about psychologically safe and healthy workplaces, we're talking about how do we, in the context of change, how do we get ourselves or get our organisations moving towards the right end, the flourishing end of the continuum?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note that with these, it's just like an individual with their individual mental health and wellbeing. It does sit on a continuum, and these are just indicators. And they're not set in stone or concrete. They are just that. They are indicators to give us an idea where we might be sitting as an organisation or a team in terms of our psychologically safe and healthy workplaces continuum. And at the upper end of that continuum, we are absolutely still seeing organisations that are thriving out there. And it is, often characterised by a high alignment to organisational values. And we're seeing that increased engagement and discretionary effort. And I think, from my perspective, that's not just about going above and beyond every day because we don't have enough staff. It's about going above and beyond when we really need to, and it's mission critical and we need to achieve an outcome. And I guess what we're seeing also at the moment with organisations that are doing well is that opportunity to take the time out and to provide that kind of consistent, skilled feedback. And doing it in a really supportive way and being flexible around the way that we are working at the moment and those challenges or those risk factors and hazards that we're facing.
Yeah, acknowledging that, again, we think about it differently, but great question up on the slide there when we talk about this notion of, where do you think your workplace sits? I think about our workplace and how it's sort of moved up and down that continuum over the last 12 or 18 months as we've gone through organisational change and a little bit of an opportunity for reflection, I suppose. It's always nice to think about, I should say, where you think your teams or your workplaces currently sit, and how do we move away from sort of this, understandably sort of reactive, if you like, approach to we need to give our teams more support. We need to give them more information. How do we start to sort of look towards that sort of longer term approach that allows us to better prepare for what's next?
Yep. Cool. And look, I guess when we start to once we've identified what our risk factors are or what our hazards are. I guess the physical risk model suggests that we move into controlling risks, and where possible, eliminating the hazard altogether. But if that isn't plausible or practicable, how do we then start to control for it? And I think when you consider some of the risks that we kind of have discussed today and the hazards that we've discussed, I don't think elimination is plausible. So how do we start to look at it, and how do we start to control for those psychological hazards and risks?
Yeah, and control's a strong word, isn't it? Is management better? How do we manage these risks more effectively? I don't know. You and I have spoken about this previously, but the notion of control might suggest that we have a greater capacity to realistically control what's causing these risks. But do we really? So I don't know. Maybe a conversation for another time.
Look, I think, for me, I like to focus in on that circle of control, Dave, and do whatever I can to spend more time in that. But I think you're right. At the end of the day, controlling for them is quite challenging. Yeah. So how do we maybe manage them or mitigate them or put some protective factors in place? Absolutely.
Yeah, so we've obviously got the physical, we know what we're supposed to do from a physical risk management perspective for, when we talk about COVID. But again, what are the ways that, we can better prepare for the psychological risks? And, we'll start to step through the systemic approach to psychologically safe and healthy workplaces. And when you see this diagram, what is it, or this?
I'll tell you what I think when I see this diagram. I think it looks like the Titanic in a sinking ship, but no, it isn't. It's an organisational cliff. And when we're starting to talk about the systemic approach to managing psychological hazards, we absolutely want to achieve a balance of these different interventions. So at the top of the cliff, obviously we have the primary or the preventative measures in place. So how do we potentially reduce exposure to the hazards? How do we start to manage those hazards and put those preventions in place? I think it's the realisation that zero harm is never possible. Yep. So we need an appropriate amount of interventions there to catch it early, because we know that the longer that someone is away from work, the less likely they are to return. So early intervention is key, not just in physical injury, but also mental injury. So how do we have the capability, skills and confidence within the workplace to be practicing early intervention? And finally, I think the injury management piece is also key. We need good, robust policies, procedures and practices in place to support employees who might be struggling or may be injured. And how do we support them through that rehabilitation journey to get them back into the work? Because we know that good work is good for people, and it can have such a positive impact and influence on people's lives. Yeah,
on their health, right?
Yep.
And whether it's physical or psychological health, good work is good for health.
Yep.
So we've probably talked about this. Do we need to talk more about the primary, the secondary and the tertiary?
I kind of jumped ahead there, didn't I?
Yeah, you did. But hey, look, I was off the ball too in terms of moving the slides forward. But and one of the things that we'll have an opportunity to hear from in the panel discussion is, we've got not only yourself, but we've got Catherine Jones and April Jones joining us. No relation, but they'll talk about their own perspectives and how. From their experiences, we can do this well, which I think will be a really useful learning opportunity. Great insights.
Absolutely. And I think across all those initiatives, leadership is absolutely key. Whether we're talking about prevention, early intervention, or a tertiary approach, we need leadership on board for a multitude of reasons. I think executive commitment is absolutely core to any initiative, and that's not just about putting the resources in place for the initiatives, but it's also about modelling the behaviour. Because it's great to say we're going to engage in proactive wellbeing strategies, go off and do them, but I'm going to sit here and work 15 hours a day and be sending emails at 12 p.m. at night. Because if we're not modelling that behaviour, then I guess the people around us are less likely to engage in it as well.
Yeah, very true. And these stats around from a financial perspective, what does it look like? And you can see there up to $10,000 for every employee with untreated depression in a workplace. And when we think about some of the stats around the prevalence of mental ill health and illness, we're looking at nearly 50% of the population over the course of their lifetime. And if we were to add that up, sure, not all of them are untreated, but we know that there's a certain level of a certain population, if you like, that refuses to engage in treatment or isn't willing to engage in treatment, and we can maybe talk about that another time.
Yep. And I think, it's you've got there one example of it, but we know that, from that injury management perspective as well, when we're looking in that tertiary space, that, there is a business case there that, mental stress claims, whilst might be a smaller percentage of all the claims, they are the most costly. Yeah,
very true. And we probably touched on this a little bit earlier on, but, this notion of disclosure, when we talk about leadership mattering, for me, the big thing here is, how do we create an environment, we talk about psychologically safe and healthy workplaces, where individuals feel comfortable in having that conversation with their leader around, around their mental ill health challenges or a diagnosis of a mental illness. And glass half full, Dave says that we're improving in this area, but we've still got a little ways to go as a society more generally.
Absolutely, and I think, whilst this suggests that 1 in 3 have not disclosed, the opposite is 2 in 3 have, which is great. But I think that ratio can improve for sure. And I guess this is probably a more sobering statistic around seeking help. And the fact that we're basically saying 1 in 2, or the research suggests that 1 in 2 employees will not seek help. And if you think about the risks and the challenges we're facing, then that's pretty significant.
Yeah. If we get a little bit more specific about this, some recent research that I've been looking at in terms of the engagement of males in treatment. We know that males are starting to engage more in treatment, but 41% of those that engage in treatment haven't meet their expectations and didn't return for a second session. So it's probably one of those things that we start to look at. What are the ways that we can improve our services, as well as just encouraging people to get into them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, then we've identified that absolutely, that there's some real challenges here. And there's, some real significant negative outcomes if we don't do it, and try to start to address some of the, these risk factors. So what can we actually do?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we had the intention, I suppose, of working through each of our non-psychosocial factors that we draw on at Communicorp. By no means, the only approach when we look at psychosocial factors, but our evidence-informed approach identifies that these are the ones that have the most traction currently. But we're always looking at ways to improve this. So maybe, Mark, one of the things we can think about is, if we're talking about the importance of leadership mattering, what are some of the most prevalent for you that jump out of these non-psychosocial factors that are important for our viewers to consider?
Yeah, and look, I think absolutely, we'll get into that. But I also like if you are listening and watching, as we kind of move through these factors, how's it impacting in your organisation? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? And we might move through them and just see how it's currently impacting. And I think with leadership, one of the biggest things in leadership that we're seeing at the moment is the tiredness, the fatigue, and the burnout with the constant change. And how important it is to be providing supportive leadership to promote that psychological safety. And one of the challenges there is working in the virtual space for a lot of organisations. And how do we provide that supportive leadership in the virtual environment? And also, I think one of the biggest challenges at the moment is the tough decisions. Making those hard decisions for organisations in the current climate and responding to it as well.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things, this is again more from a clinical perspective, but one of the really interesting things that we often talk about not feeling as comfortable or not feeling as though the virtual environment has as greater effect on as face-to-face interactions. Yeah, sure, there's limitations to it, but from a utility perspective or a support perspective, it's still the research shows us that the virtual environment still has the capacity to provide the support that people require. It's just our sort of perspective that it's not the same. We acknowledge that it isn't, but there's still an opportunity to feel supported and give support, which is critical, right?
Absolutely. And I guess it leads quite nicely there into psychological support and capability. And I guess that's the challenge at the moment, and what we see a big question mark around is how do we actually do that in the virtual environment? What does that actually look like? What does good engagement look like in that virtual environment? Do I have the capability, skills, and confidence to recognise those early warning signs? And how do I do that when I might not necessarily be having all those incidental interactions, either with my colleagues or with the people that we work with on a regular basis?
Yeah.
So how do we start to maybe create some of those opportunities for those incidental interactions? And also how do we, I guess, either remind ourselves or upskill in that recognition of those early warning signs?
Yeah, which funnily enough, and one of the things about our non-psychosocial factors is that they play quite nicely, or they interrelate, I should say, and we talk about respectful relationships and engagement. Again, we think about the lag, and sometimes, when we're engaging in a virtual team, what does that mean for a group of 15 peers to have effective and meaningful conversations? But if we adjust and give ourselves the opportunity to adapt, then we can start to do this well. Noting or acknowledging that there's some limitations around that, right?
Yeah. And I think this is a real key one, and one that really stands out for me at the moment in the current climate is other psychological job demands, which are unique demands or risks within roles that could potentially cause harm. And I think, when we're talking about customer-facing staff, one of the big things we're seeing at the moment is the increased rates of aggressive customer behaviour. And I'd also argue that some of that behaviour is more severe in nature as well. We're seeing, different demands being placed on us in terms of the way that we work as well, and that those psych job demands are changing for some roles very quickly, and maybe not necessarily having the opportunity or the time to spend in terms of upskilling to meet those demands. So that can be quite challenging.
What does my new role actually look like? And that's the big challenge. If I don't know what it looks like, then there's all these other things that can sort of play into my hazards, if you like.
Recognition, reward, and development is an interesting one in the current space as well, because those opportunities for those normal development pathways may have been reduced. We might not necessarily have that opportunity for that career progression that we did prior. The opportunity to engage in that informal recognition of just dropping by someone's desk or cubicle and saying, hey, look, thanks for doing that for me, I really appreciate it. So, thinking about how that actually plays out in the current environment, and how do we start to create the opportunity for that to occur. And how important it is to just, the ability to say thank you to someone and come from a genuine and meaningful place.
Yeah, very true, very true. And there's a couple more we'll step through here, and psychological job demands and work role and demands. Again, what is, when we go through COVID, we change the way we work. We potentially have, a broader organisational change that affects what aspects of our job we should be doing, or what aspects are we focusing on. What are we providing to our clients? There's this great challenge around, how do we start to do it better? And I think there's no set answer here. It's very much about, what am I doing to try and better understand what this means for me right now, and what this means for my team.
Absolutely.
Moving into the future.
And I think we've covered off on organisational change quite a bit today, so we might move on to Psych Safety.
Yeah, right.
And, when we talk about psychological safety, it's this idea that I actually feel safe sticking my hand up and asking for help.
Yep.
And that might be as simple as asking help for a task.
Yeah.
In terms of, doing my job properly.
Yeah.
Or potentially seeking support for an injury. Or seeking support for compromised mental health. And I think, psychological safety is quite correlated with organisational culture as well.
Yeah.
And I think that plays a broader piece across all these factors in terms of how do we generate and create organisational culture in either a virtual world, a reduced world, or even a mixed modal world where we might see some people working from home, we might see some people in the office, we might see some people on site, depending on the industry and where we are. And how do we actually bring people together to create that organisational culture and generate that psych safety? And I think another real challenge to start to look at how do we address that factor in the current climate.
Yeah, and I mean, when you talk about culture there, I think one of the really interesting things to highlight is, again, not my quote, Dr. Michael Gervais, a performance psychologist out of the States, talks about culture being the artefact of relationships. And I think, when we start to drill into what these psychosocial factors are, they're very much about, how do we create a workplace or an environment that has effective relationships. That doesn't mean that we aren't challenged and we don't experience stress. But how do we create an environment where the leadership team, the workplace itself, and the environment more generally promotes this notion of engagement and safety as a means to be able to achieve their job. Yeah. Physical safety is the last one there, and what would we say about that? It's less our bag, but equally important when we consider the effect that it has on stress and outside of stress, mental health and well-being.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's skip ahead. We won't spend too long on this because we've been rabbiting on for a little bit now. It's probably important to get our panel members in here.
Absolutely.
But, should we talk about these stats? They're there. We probably should. I feel like if we skip through the slides, it might seem a bit weird. Why do we want to do this? What are the reasons for investing in mental health in the workplace? Well, we can see there for every dollar invested, $2.30 return on investment, and that's a benefit to the organisation's bottom line. Whilst that should never be the focus, we know that it's important that we consider, what are the financial benefits of doing this well? And obviously we think back to some of those stats around the effects of illness and ill health.
And I think, again, looking at that economic case for it, it's not just about the organisation, but the economy as the whole. And I think, when we're talking about the ability to spend in this space, knowing that there is going to be an ROI, not just in the personal space, but also from the economic space as well.
Yeah. So that's it. Obviously, that's a little bit of a weird slide. We can't actually. I don't have any questions for you. I will in a moment, though, when we get the other panel members in here. So if we just take a moment to let people compose their answers, and we'll start to set up the panel for more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we'll do now is, I think that absolutely ends the kind of formal presentation. We're going to move into the question and answer section, and Dave will introduce the panel members shortly. But I hope that content has started to frame for you, around this idea of what are some of those psychosocial hazards or psychological risk factors that we're definitely seeing across industry at the moment, and the research is telling us that are out there as well. And what are some of those potential controls that might be in place to start to address that from a more systemic perspective rather than reactionary in nature. So absolutely, as we move into the question component, happy for questions to come through on any of those kind of topics that we've discussed, and we'll see what our panel of experts, potentially me excluded, can come up with in terms of answers on the spot.
We've got our panel members joining us, and I'll give a brief introduction to each of these panel members, with the exception of Mark, of course, because you've already heard from him. So first and foremost, we've got Catherine Jones joining us. Catherine's a senior leader with over 20 years' experience in the health, safety and wellbeing environment. Catherine has a deep expertise across financial services, infrastructure, road transport, labour hire and public health. A passionate and influential leader who collaborates across organisations to diagnose priority focus areas, build systems and programs to address all areas of health and safety risk. Catherine is well versed in delivering programs to address contemporary safety issues, specifically including psychological risk. Catherine, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. We've also got April Jones. April is a registered psychologist and is a Global Clinical Services Director at Assure Programs in Queensland. She's been working with Assure in WA and Queensland for approximately 13 years. Her background consists of wellbeing and psychological services, EAP programs and vocational rehabilitation. April's role is responsible for the clinical quality and governance of the psychological services delivered by Assure programs. April, great to have you here as well.
Thanks for having me as well.
All right, it's a pleasure. And of course, we've got Mark as the third member of our panel. So as we wait for questions, more questions to pop up here, we've got a couple that have just come in. And I may well start in throwing a question over to Catherine first and foremost. Catherine, thinking about the information that you just heard and your experience more broadly, what are some of the best strategies and controls, if you like, that you've seen in your experience to manage psychological risk longer term?
Look, I think it's important to have a suite of controls in place and really understand what your people need in terms of looking at the challenges they're facing. And there's no one-size-fits-all with managing psychological risk. So understanding the challenges of your people and then having a range of controls that they can tap into, because something might work for one person, may not work for another, or for one person one day and not the next week because of what's happening in their lives. So it's really important to have a range of things and looking at credible and evidence-based approaches to managing psychological risk.
Yeah, and April, I guess in your experience, is there something that jumps out at you as critically important in what Catherine said there?
Yeah, absolutely, everything that she said. And I think from an EAP perspective, we get a real range of information coming through with the data and all of the sessions. And I think it's really important for leaders to really know their people and to really promote, the mental health area and looking for strategies as to what suits their culture in an organisation.
Yeah, great. Next question from Nicola Hogan. One of the sort of questions for Mark. Kind of a loaded question, but we'll see where it goes. You mentioned a systemic approach to psychological health and safety in your presentation just before. What are the examples of one important consideration in each area?
Yeah, wow. Really good question. And so I guess if we move through and we'll start with prevention, I think the key critical component there for me in terms of prevention is probably leveraging what Catherine mentioned earlier. And that's very much, firstly, understanding what the risks are for the organisations and the teams, and having a strategy in place to start to address those risks that are there. From a secondary or early intervention component, I think absolutely that probably the capability across the organisation to be able to have the conversation. So basically recognising what some of those early warning signs of compromised mental health are, and more importantly having the confidence to be asking about it and having those conversations on a regular basis, so it becomes part of the culture, and it isn't just out of the blue. So we're comfortable with those wellbeing conversations. And from a tertiary perspective, look, it's not something that we necessarily specialise in, but I think absolutely having that strong process around returning people to work that is as soon as reasonable for the injury. So that we continue to engage them with work during that kind of rehabilitation phase, so that we look at getting them back into the workplace, because and doing it in line with what the injury and recommendations are.
And working closely with the partners that they have, the external partners, I think are really important for those areas as well, whether it's your rehab counsellors and your insurance companies or your EAP providers. I think that all comes into that strategy.
Absolutely, and I'd like to add to that. Most organisations do have partnerships with experts in the field to tap into them. They already know the organisation, they know your people, and then to Mark's point around ensuring that the leaders, those frontline managers who are managing themselves through COVID and uncertain times, as well as their teams, to ensure that they've got the capability, the skills, and access to the resources to be able to support their people and to support themselves day to day.
Yeah, it's such a critical point, isn't it? I think we often focus with leaders in terms of how do we support everyone around us.
Yeah.
But I think, one of those core components is that we absolutely need to be able to look after ourselves as well. And there's someone in our team who uses an analogy around a cup and the fact that we can't pour from an empty cup. And so we need to consistently keep topping that cup up so that we have something to pour from. And if we don't look after ourselves as leaders, then it's really hard to look after those around us.
And role model what's out there for our people as well. So being able to access the resources as leaders so that our people can access it and feel very comfortable around that too.
Because the leaders set the tone. So if the leaders are acting in a psychologically sound way and looking after their own well-being, people will do the same, and that you'll see the spread across the organisation and the teams.
And it reminds me of a conversation I was having the other day in the leadership space around appropriate vulnerability. That actually, as a leader, it's okay to be vulnerable at times and to demonstrate that we're all going through this together. It is really tough, and it's normal to be struggling at the moment, depending on where we are and what we're doing. And to show that's okay, it's human.
Absolutely.
And I've seen that play out recently in a very positive way, where a leader came out and said, "I'm actually not okay, and it's okay to not be okay." And the impact on the people listening as part of that team was actually the Melbourne community, who are all going through a tougher time than the rest of the country, and the impact that it had on those people. And you could really see a shift in the dynamic and culture and the conversation that were coming out of that team. So there's a lot of power behind that role modelling and having the conversations.
And I think I probably see that a lot in the EAP space, because that's where people come, the individuals, employees, staff, family members, but also the leaders. So we have a lot of resources set up to support managers and leaders to have conversations or to look after themselves and get through difficult times. So, knowing what your who your EAP provider is and what their resources are can be really critical to be able to support yourselves and the rest of the group.
It's a really good point, April, and I suppose one of the other questions we see that I've seen come up from Nicolette Spicer is around these notions that you talked about modelling for leaders, but some of the other actions required from leaders that allows for an EAP service to be most effective in an organisation. What are some of those other considerations that you're aware of in your experience?
Sure. Look, I think one of the really important things is to destigmatise mental health, and to be able to really promote mental health in a way that is not just about illness. So, from an EAP perspective, again, I think it's really important for leaders and top level to demonstrate that they really embrace EAP services and other resources as well, and to invite EAP providers into their space, into their workspaces, whether it's face-to-face or virtually now that we're doing it a little bit differently, and just to talk through what it is that people can access and how they can use these services and really make a difference in their lives before they've got to a point where they feel like they have to stop working or they are becoming unwell. So it's really important to say to people, look, this EAP service, it's an amazing service of experts and clinicians that can make a difference in people's lives, both for the work-related issues but also personal issues. So I think really encouraging that conversation to occur and to have a lot of promotion around those sorts of services is a really great way for us to build that too.
And I've seen some organisations do that in some really novel and unique ways that I think has worked really well. in terms of promoting mental health and not just mental ill health and seeking support, but through things like even having some short videos up on the wellbeing portal from leaders within, respected leaders within the organisation around some of their own challenges that they may have experienced in the past and how they sought assistance and, kind of normalising that to leaders actually just having that conversation with staff and saying, you know what, actually I have called EAP myself and this is what happens. And I think, there's different, and, some leaders who have, held regular town halls with their staff during the current climate. And part of it inviting questions and actually talking about, well, how do I cope during this period? Yeah. What are some of the things that I do to maintain my own well-being?
And Are You OK Day is a great example of that. You can have a bit of fun. You can get the cupcakes going and the balloons like we did. But we could do a lot more of those types of events going forward and just allow people to be able to talk freely about how they're feeling.
And even sharing stories about coping strategies. Yeah. There's been some great conversations I've seen across the industry of people talking about how they are coping with lockdown or with not working in the office, working from home.
Ideas coming through.
Yeah, and just really sharing those and there's such a sense of community and some really innovative ideas in which people are coping, and you feel like you're not alone. Yep. And that's a really important message to get amongst your people as well.
Yeah, I think one of the best ones I heard the other week was someone who would literally walk out of their home office, jump in the car, drive around the block, come back home, just to mimic that commute, just to have that bit of third space to transition from working from home to back into family. And I thought that was such a novel tip, and I thought that was great.
Yeah.
So a question from Ian Bajike. No specific panel member, but more to the panel generally. From the presentation, there was a reference earlier that many people with a mental illness don't disclose within their workplaces. We saw the stats there. How would you, any of you on the panel, encourage managers to empower individuals to share their experiences so that they can be best supported, and particularly in organisations who haven't invested sort of resources into psych safety?
So I'm just going to clarify the question there, Dave. So
yeah, sure, mate.
Two parts to it. So one is how do we promote people to I guess seek help within the organisation, and the other component of where resources might not necessarily be invested.
Well, yeah, looking specifically at the manager's capacity to empower individuals, empower their staff as a means to disclose. Yeah.
Look, I think, from my perspective, the first thing is that it's okay not to be okay, and normalising that. And for the managers to kind of start to build in those wellbeing conversations into kind of their everyday practices, whether it's one-on-ones, team meetings, and the like. And I think the other part is also just getting to know your staff, knowing what baseline is, to be able to start to look out for what some of those early warning signs might be. If we don't know our staff, then it's actually really hard to pick up on that.
Disclosure is an interesting thing because it depends on potentially the history of an organisation and the culture and, maybe what the consequences might be. But I do think we're moving, particularly now, during this time of COVID-19, that we're a lot more willing to talk about those types of things, look at flexibility, look at opportunities for people to do things differently. I think this is a great time to really give all of our staff, I suppose, the confidence to say that they're not okay, because it's almost okay to be not okay right now. So this is a really nice time to model some really good behaviours and come up with some ideas and some responses that are going to make people feel more comfortable to talk about how they're going, and even if they have got pre-existing conditions, it shouldn't matter.
And I think this really has got the conversation on the table if it wasn't already on there. And there's such a groundswell to talk about it, to get access to information. There's some really great, free resources to tap into if your organisation doesn't invest in an EAP provider or only has minimal resources available. There's a lot out there. And it's tapping into those things and to Mark's point, knowing your people, having that relationship with them, understanding what's normal, even if it is now virtually versus sitting in the same room as them. There are some cues to pick up on, and that gives you the prompt to have that conversation. Are you okay? What's going on for you? And then supporting them to seek help.
And I think, when we start to, I think you raise a really good point there, Catherine, around for those organisations who might be a little bit resource poor in this space. And I often think about, small to medium enterprise. And there's a lot of amazing work being done at the moment by the regulators.
Absolutely.
And, we see it in Safe Work and WorkSafe at the state level. In terms of some of the amazing investment that's actually being put into that, and some really awesome products out there to start to engage with, and to kind of start to leverage some of that information to kind of start to I guess digest some of these complex topics.
Absolutely.
Okay, another question for Catherine. So, Catherine, thinking about one example when an organisation that you're working with or for committed to improving mental health, workplace mental health, I should say, what did you see the leaders do differently to help initiate and make that change?
Look, I think of a really positive example where the leadership team really embraced the piece of work and really understood why we're needing to do this, and then really getting into the mix, if you like, to really understand what's going on for their people. So tapping into those stories about what's happening for them day to day from a psychological safety risk perspective, and then really considering what is going to work for us and what's going to fit into the broader culture of the organisation to really shift and put better controls in place and better supports that is not seen as an add-on in the organisation. It fits naturally with the other priorities they have going on, and as well as the culture of the organisation.
Yeah, great. And so, Mark, that was something Mark referenced earlier, talking about executive commitment. What are the ways that we can ensure that this is a sort of a top-down, bottom-up approach? Mark, is there something you wanted to expand on from that perspective?
Well, look, I think where examples in the past where it has worked well is when it's made a priority. And I think we see executive commitment come in many different shapes and sizes. And obviously there's a comms piece around it, but it's got to be more. It's got to be a priority. And if we don't invest in our people, then we're not going to get the best out of them. And so when it's actually listed and followed up on as an organisational priority, I think that's when I've seen it work the best.
And people given the time to access. So a lot of organisations give a lot of information and talk about programs, but do they adjust people's work schedules and time to actually engage in those programs? And it's to Mark's point about it really being a priority for the organisation as to what they're investing their time in.
I think the leaders need to be real ambassadors and be genuine about what's going on and to sort of talk the talk and walk the walk. And we were involved with a number of organisations that have done the top down, and they were the most effective. And the individual staff members really did feel safe once the top end were being really involved in what they were trying to promote.
Yeah, great example. A question from Mark Penno. Sorry if I got the pronunciation of your last name wrong there, Mark. Our people from our call centre are now working from home and have been for 6 months now. Not all, but many have become accustomed to working from home, and enthusiasm to return to the office, even for social connection and workshopping days, etc., seems to be waning, even from the leaders. Any suggestions on how to promote the value of and desire to return to connecting together again?
Who wants to take this one? It's a really complex question, isn't it?
It's really complex, but it's quite normal. I'm seeing that a lot. Even our own call centre is working remotely at the moment, and I think that they are feeling very productive and very safe. So, we have to take all of that into consideration, that the safety aspect hasn't been completely sorted out yet for public transport and, getting up to floors at 21 levels, etc. So I think it's about being flexible and potentially even having trials, small groups and trials to get people back and, seeing what they need. And we have to be different now. I think it's more agile anyway. So, but yes, I think the engagement is really important. I think connectivity is really important. So looking at ways to try and get that to happen is important.
And to that point, I think people are comfortable with their working from home setup in terms of, are they feeling safe working there? They know the office environment, once they actually get there, is safe, but it's the in-between piece, which is outside of their control and outside of the employer's control, which is, I think, challenging a lot of people. And I've seen people really excited to get back to the office, come in and find that, I'm on an empty floor, I'm the only one here. So looking ways for leaders to say, okay, get a group of people, to your point, April, around getting, being flexible around and having little trials of smaller groups and then build that up. And people generally do what their team members are doing. It's that flow-on effect. So if you get a few leaders in terms of doing that, you'll get some other people on board. But some people may also, really struggle with it and really will take that extra prodding to get to that point if that's what they need to do.
Yeah. And look, Mark, I think it's a great question you've asked, and I think the key behind change, whatever that change is understanding the why. I think people connect with the why, and that often drives the motivation. So if I'm just coming back into the call centre to do the same job that I could have just been doing from home, and I've added 2 hours of commute and feeling unsafe, then that's going to spark that kind of sense of, potentially, that sense of resentment or disgruntlement or whatever the case might be. So I think if we're looking at what drives people is making sure that there's clear purpose behind it, and we're taking the time out to explain to people why we're doing it, and what the benefits are from actually coming into the office as well. And maybe it's not just to come in to do my job, everyday job, but it's actually we're coming in, we're having a team function, we might be doing some training, we're going to have that opportunity and that ability to remain flexible around it and figure out what that new normal does look like for people.
Another question coming from someone that's asked not to be identified. So for Mark, how long will it take us to improve the mental health of our staff following COVID? And what do you suggest we should be doing now?
I can ask why that person asked not to be identified. Unfortunately, my crystal ball is broken today. But in terms of how long, I don't think anyone could answer that. I think that in terms of improving mental health, would suggest that there's a problem there. And I'd suggest that what's happening at the moment is quite normal and is a challenge. I think if we, what can we be doing now though to look forward? I think it is that opportunity, as we highlighted up front of the session, to really stop, pause and reflect on what we are doing. And I would suggest that we really need to start looking at that prevention approach to mental health. And that's very much understanding what those risks are. And if we're looking at, post-COVID, whatever post-COVID is, it's about understanding how those risks change. So it's not a set and forget activity. It's about, we need to have a strong structure in place to have that capability to really be reviewing what those psychosocial hazards are, so that we can address them and have the appropriate interventions in place to be managing them, and to have that continual conversation around it.
I think also people like to know what's happening. So I think from a mental health perspective, leaders can be planning and working out some great strategies, but if they don't share that with the people that are in their teams, then you get some distress and sort of feel like, well, I'm not sure that I'm connected, and I don't really know what's happening, and so that anxiety level starts to build again. So I think keeping your teams really informed as to what your plans are will be helpful.
Okay, thanks, panel. One other question that's come through from Eliza Cooper. Eliza asks to April, now kind of similar to one of the previous questions, but we'll go with it and see how the answer differs. Your top tip for leaders keen on improving mental health in the workplace. We've talked about the importance of modelling. We've talked about the importance of discussing the desire to change and making that extant, so people across the organisation knows what is happening. So, what's that sort of top tip that if you had to give one, actually, let's extend it and say you can give a couple.
Can I give a couple? Oh, okay. No pressure.
No pressure.
Look, I think if we're talking about improving the mental health of workplaces, I think resilience is probably a word that comes to mind, that organisations need to have a look at what's happening from a resilience point of view. What are they doing, or what can they do to promote resilience of the organisation? And, I know Communicorp in particular has some great resilience programs. There's lots of different tools that can be brought into the workplace to help individuals just having ownership around their own resilience, because I think that's really important. It's not about leaders or organisations doing everything, but it's about helping them to have the tools to do things and empower people. And, you talk about that locus of control that you covered today. So I think that's a really key thing to have organisations consider what's going on in that resilience space. I think resources is really important. So whether they're online resources or there's small groups that get together and sort of have information sessions and education around different topics, I think is really important. Having opportunities to really find out what staff are looking for, because a lot of organisations are doing really well, and I think you touched on that today. So not everyone is going to need to change things. There's a lot of people that have really embraced this time to go and do some self-development, or to feel like they have taken control over how they're going to cope going through this. So I think finding out what they need and then looking at ways to implement that.
And I think the future planning piece, one thing I've seen being done really well in some organisations is future planning. So looking at people's career paths and career progression, things that they can look forward to and control, rather than just sort of thinking about the things that aren't going right for them now, to build that hope and that forward planning into their career journey and their personal journey.
Mark, I felt like you were going to say something there. I may be putting you on the spot, but...
Oh, look, I think, what April mentioned around that individual accountability piece really echoes with me. And that, I think at the end of the day, we do need to have that individual accountability around our own well-being as well. And yes, I think as organisations, we absolutely have a responsibility to be addressing psychosocial hazards and risks, but as an individual, we also have that same accountability. And that is that accountability to be able to engage with that self-care, whatever that looks like for that individual. And so I think, for me, that really resonates. And it's, from an organisational perspective, then it's about providing, as you mentioned, the opportunity to engage with that. Yeah.
All right, great. Well, we've still got a few more minutes. So if anyone has additional questions that they'd like to send through, please feel free to do so now. I guess to give them that opportunity, I'm thinking of a question that comes up for me. We've heard a lot recently, and for any member of the panel can answer this. We've heard a lot recently about this focus on mental ill health and illness and the longer term impacts or effects of COVID. If we take a step back and we think about what are some of the key messages that we'd like to promote as from your own experiences and perspectives, what are the key takeaway, or one key takeaway for people to consider when they finish up this live stream today? What would it be for you? I'll start with you, Mark.
Yeah. So, look, my one key takeaway, it's really hard to narrow it down to one. Look, I think if it's a two-part one key takeaway. The first part is to recognise that absolutely, from an organisational perspective, just like we put procedure, strategy and controls in place for physical risk, we need to be doing it for psychological risk as well. I guess as part of that, the importance of that continuous review and evaluation of the things that we do to address it. And I think that can be a massive step for some organisations, but even just starting that journey, if that's the key takeaway today, then I think that's a really positive thing to walk away with.
Over to you, April.
For me, I think there's so much pressure on leaders right now, and I guess I really feel for that group of people that are in situations that is a little bit foreign for them, whether it's the change in the workplace or the demands, etc. So, I suppose I would like to see leaders having a think about what they need as well, so that, as we talked about earlier, if the leaders are doing well, then they'll automatically be more compassionate and more engaged with their people. And I think that's what they need to look at. What can they do as individuals, as leaders, and then that will flow down.
Great, thanks April. And Catherine?
And for me, it echoes with some of what Mark said around check in to see with what you've got in place and what you're doing, is it actually achieving the results that you expected, and is it actually helping your people in terms of managing their mental health?
Righto, great. Look, we've had one last question come in. Should we entertain it since it's come in? From Pat Smith, that is his real name. Talking about the increased importance of leaders getting to know their people during COVID-19, and Catherine sort of building on that notion of checking in with individuals and teams. What are the tips from the panel to check in with those more sort of introverted, quiet individuals who are historically not connected to the team or with leadership? I don't know, from anyone.
The first thing that comes to mind is ask that person, how would they like me to? How would you like me to check in with you, and to see what they say, and go from there and build on that.
Great.
I'd probably just be more direct and just check in, I think, because often an introvert isn't going to ask you to do that, but they often respond really well. So I think just being quite regular with your check-ins is important.
Great, thanks April.
Yeah, and I think absolutely, concur with both what Catherine and April said there in terms of, asking the individual what they want, and seeing if they come forward, and being direct in terms of building in those regular check-ins, and I guess also creating the opportunity for those incidental interactions virtually, and that can be really tough. But team drinks where people can drop in, team activities via Zoom. That opportunity to get people into an environment that actually allows them to discuss something other than work as well. And even, engaging their families at home if that's appropriate for the workplace. And actually, having some events where families can drop in. A colleague mentioned the other day in their organisation, they had a Zoom yoga class where families were able to join, and I thought that was a really novel idea of ways that they can actually start to reach people and try and make it inclusive.
Yeah, without having to communicate too much, I suppose, as well. Yeah, nice. Look, that probably brings us to the end of the Q&A panel. So to Catherine and April, thank you very much for giving up your time this afternoon to come along and sit on the panel. I've really enjoyed hearing the responses to your questions and your insights into how do we do this notion of workplace mental health better. And what I might do is I might throw over to you, Mark, to finish up, to wrap up the SLBF today.
Awesome, thanks very much, Dave. Again, I wanted to reiterate what Dave said and say thank you very much to Catherine and April for joining us this afternoon to have what I think is a very important discussion around psychological risk in the workplace at the moment. And I also wanted to extend that gratitude to our viewers today, taking 90 minutes out of your workday to attend a session like this. I know it's a tough ask at times. We are very busy at the moment. But I really hope that you did get something out of it, that you did take that opportunity to stop, pause and reflect on what you are currently doing within your organisations and even what you're doing for yourself at the moment to manage positive mental health. So thank you very much. I hope we've achieved our aims. We've hopefully generated some thought around the topic and hopefully taken that opportunity to walk away with a few different ideas. So with that, we will finish our Communicorp's first virtual SLBF, and we would love to hear your feedback. So please take the opportunity to shoot us an email at info@communicorpgroup.com. Tell us if you loved it, you hated it, or otherwise, because as the world continues to evolve, these things may become more regular. So anything that we can do to improve, we'd be keen to hear.